Les heaved for air as he finally knocked down the long-dead tree log from its place onto the ground. The boy nearly collapsed onto the ground himself from exhaustion, but instead, he forced himself to stand on his feet and lean on the makeshift axe he had crafted with his bare hands, from a sharp stone, rope, and a stick. He heaved for air, wiping a layer of sweat off his brow with the back of his free hand, then on his coat. He shut his eyes for a few seconds before he reopened them, hauled his axe over his shoulders, then grasped the log before he walked back to his makeshift shelter he made out of twigs, logs, and bark a week ago, collected from the natural resources of the forest. Despite the log being much smaller and lighter than what he was used to, Les still grunted and sweated as he dragged the log behind his now home and tossed the thing onto the log pile that he had collected the days over. To the traveling survivor, this would be seen as unnecessary and a waste of time and energy. However, if that survivor was named Les and struggled to build even a fucking shelter, considering he already had a roof over his head, so he never found the need to learn how to build a shelter, then they would find having extra wood on hand to be helpful. Les had lost count on how many times his makeshift shelter fell apart on him when he was building it, till he finally did something right and finished the damn thing. However, it wasn't as perfect, as there were holes in the top of the shelter that would leak in water whenever it chose to rain. Les wasn't an expert, but he knew he had to collect more shit from the forest in order to not get rained on. But only after it stopped raining. That was exactly what Les did, gathering up leaves, twigs, and many other shit around the wilderness to cover up the holes in the shelter. This worked out great for Les, surprising the young boy much more than what he was expecting. However, even with that little success of his, Les knew that he couldn't mess around anymore, as this place wasn't the house, and there weren't other kids wandering around the place, helping each other whenever they could. And though Les wasn't always a fan of the kids in the house, he had to admit they were pretty good and effective at whatever job they were put at. Les wasn't entirely knowledgeable of everything beyond the house, but he learned enough about the forest to know how to survive, minus the whole shelter accident, so he knew what to look out for in a clearing, for the most important thing a human or child needed: water. Thankfully for Les, the clearing he first stopped at the first night he was here had a small pond close to the cave he rested in, so getting a quick drink and some water for the road wasn't a big problem. The problem was traveling in the forest, and not just because of the forest's natural elements fucking him over. There were also several hidden traps around the wilderness that he wasn't aware of, and he nearly got killed by some of them. Falling logs, more snare nets that came downwards instead of going up, etc. And those were just the tip of the iceberg of what was truly going on in these empty woods. Or, at least, what Les thought was going on in the wilderness. Never in all his 10 years of living on this planet did Les think he was capable of making an 80k meter sprint through an uneven dirt path. But panic and adrenaline does funny things to your body. Even though Les did get to inherit some skills and stamina from the house, even he privately admitted that all that running and dodging these traps had killed off most of the energy Les had gathered from last night's rest. And that was something the boy never thought he would do ever since he left the house. Of course, that move caused Les to sigh heavily and slapped his hand across his face in some weird attempt to slap some sense into him or something. The trip went rather smoothly, besides nearly tripping over a couple of uprooted tree roots or rocks, or something like that, and that made Les silently breathe a sigh of relief, something that he normally would have hated letting out on a normal day of the week. But considering the amount of death and danger he had to dodge for the past few minutes or more, the mismatched-eyed child couldn't entirely blame himself for showing some weakness this time around. However, the peace didn't last long, as when Les crossed the path to go downwards, the black-haired boy somehow got both his feet caught in between each foot and tripped down a thankfully short, steep hill, stumbling a few feet down before coming to a complete stop at the bottom of the hill. Thankfully, the fall didn't hurt him or broke any bones in his body, but it did get dirt on him. Les cringed hard when he stood up and looked at the amount of dirt and dust collected on his coat. He rolled his eyes as he brushed himself off. Once finished with that task, Les snorted with annoyance and continued on his journey. If he hadn't been so annoyed, then he would have taken notice of the very obvious string running across the path. His left foot stomped on the string, and in seconds, a small log suspended on ropes came shooting right at the boy. Les barely had time to react before the thing hit him square in the face and sent him tumbling into a tree in a ragdoll fashion. He struggled to get up, but eventually he gave up and collapsed onto the ground, falling unconscious. A few long minutes passed before Les finally regained consciousness and continued on his trek, even with a pounding headache flooding his nerves. The boy sighed heavily as he rested a hand against his head. "Fucking son of a bitch," Les muttered under his breath as he walked along, feeling angry at both himself for not noticing the log and the log itself hitting him in the face. To say the rest of his journey was unpleasant was an understatement, to say the least. Les could hardly focus on the rest of the day with the headache pounding his brain with nearly every step he took, and his vision would become blurry at random times. As much as Les didn't want to stop and rest for a second time, he had to, unless he wanted to suddenly pass out and get killed by either a trap or whatever the hell existed out there. Between these two choices, one was obviously the better one. It was almost nearing the mid-afternoon, or maybe the evening by the time Les woke up. The boy didn't recall any memories of what time period it was when he woke up. Either way, Les was soon wandering through the wilderness with a slightly less pounding headache, and muttering several complaints under his breath. If anyone who wasn't aware of his situation saw him and heard the shit he was mumbling under his breath, they would have assumed he was an entitled brat or something like that, and to the kids of the house, Les definitely seemed like the type to be an entitled brat. However, if they lived in the boy's shoes for a week, then they would be just as pissed as Les. Maybe. The rest of the day was simply a giant blurry bitch fest, but regardless of whether or not Les remembered the other details, he barely managed to drag his dumbass through the rest of the path he had chose and came across another forest clearing. This one much better than the last one, considering it had a better source of water. Not a river, but a running stream that was bigger than the small pond he had found previously. By this time, the sky had become dark, and it was too late to properly set up anything. Les didn't want to do anything else other than collapse into a deep sleep, which was exactly what he did after he found a safe place, which was a high tree. When he woke up the next morning, Les got up with, thankfully, no headache, and started with his day of building his place of residence. Starting with the shelter, because obviously Les no longer had a roof over his head, and if he were forced to still sleep out exposed to the elements, then Les might be even more trouble than he thought. And we all know how that went, lol. Anyways, the log Les had been carrying was nearly carelessly tossed aside into the pile of logs he had stacked up over the time he lived in here. The logs jumped a bit from their place as another one was added on, but as the other log fell still, so did the others. Les sighed with relief as the extra weight on his shoulders was lifted, minus his axe, but that thing was somehow 10 times more lighter than the log. He wiped the free sweat off his brow, then set his axe by his makeshift shelter. Man, that was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, Les croaked, his voice cracking with each word he said. It was obvious to Les that his throat was as dry as bloody sandpaper, and he needed to get water right now, so the mismatched-eyed child walked away from his log pile over to the inside of his shelter, where a few of his personal and important belongings were. Some that once belonged to her. Les shuddered and shook his head to clear it of his thoughts. Ones that he'd rather not think about at the moment, choosing instead to focus on his water bottle that he smartly filled to the brim with fresh water beforehand. Les took it, popped the lid, and took a huge swig of the refreshing liquid, like a drunk man would down a shot of hard alcohol. Since he had done so much work in the last few minutes, nearly half the thing was downed, and soon only half water was left in the thing. It would have to be refilled with fresh water. Thankfully for him, Les lived next to a freshwater stream, so water wasn't an issue. Food, on the other hand, Les felt his stomach growl at the mere mention of food. Ugh. The boy sighed as he rested a hand on his now empty stomach, head looking down at his torso, as if his own body had just insulted him personally. Well, time to head out, Les sighed to himself, rolling his eyes as he walked around his shelter, gathering up his useful shit in a leather bag that he got from the house, which included his metal bat, then stopping outside, heading into the wilderness. It was obvious to Les that his throat was as dry as bloody sandpaper, and he needed to get water right now. So the mismatched-eyed child walked away from his log pile over to the inside of his shelter, where a few of his personal and important belongings were. Some that once belonged to her. Les shuddered and shook his head to clear it of his thoughts. Ones that he'd rather not think about at the moment, choosing instead to focus on his water bottle that he smartly filled to the brim with fresh water beforehand. Les took it, popped the lid, and took a huge swig of the refreshing liquid, like a drunk man would down a shot of hard alcohol. Since he had done so much work in the last few minutes, nearly half the thing was downed, and soon only half water was left in the thing. It would have to be refilled with fresh water. Thankfully for him, Les lived next to a freshwater stream, so water wasn't an issue. Food, on the other hand, Les felt his stomach growl at the mere mention of food. Ugh. The boy sighed as he rested a hand on his now empty stomach, head looking down at his torso, as if his own body had just insulted him personally. Well, time to head out, Les sighed to himself, rolling his eyes as he walked around his shelter, gathering up his useful shit in a leather bag that he got from the house, which included his metal bat, then stopping outside, heading into the wilderness.